who are all allocated a fixed amount at 64 kbps, but then the darkened line are the only 2 users that are actually using the bandwidth that's been allocated to them. That's why it's wasted, because those 2 that aren't filled in have that bandwidth, but it's just resting there, not being utilized. Slide. Demand assigned bandwidth gives an exact amount for each user. No input is dedicated. So this is very similar to your internet service that you have like at your house. Slide. So again, we have our total bandwidth of 256 kilobits with each of the 3 users that are utilizing that bandwidth assigned an exact amount. So like our first user has 64 kbps, second has 9.6, and then the next has 56. But then what's left over of the available total bandwidth is just sitting on the wing waiting to be used. So if anybody else wanted to connect to it, they could, and then they could have the leftover portion, for lack of a better expression, to use for whatever it is that they need concerning their mission, or if they need to transmit any kind of intelligence or data. Slide. Dynamic bandwidth is considered the combined input rates from all users, and it exceeds the available bandwidth. So what that means is like Boingo. So you all have Boingo internet at the dorms, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you're only allotted a specific amount of bandwidth per the ISP's contract that they're obligated to give you for your building. But then you have everybody and their mom that's on the internet at the dorms trying to get on at the same time. So during peak hours, when you're on before that, you'll know when the peak hours start as far as like when everybody's online, because everything will be good, and then all of a sudden things will start to slow way down, or you may end up experiencing some kind of server connectivity issues, and you'll just get booted off the internet entirely. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. I was going to say, because that should be a relatively easy one to remember. So dynamic bandwidths like Boingo. Slide. So here you see that there's that 256. We're going to keep using that in these examples. So you have your 256 kbps total bandwidth still. But then if you add up all of the sum of, or the aggregate of each user input or throughput, it's at 384 kbps, which exceeds, and that's when you'll start experiencing that connection degradation. Slide. Time of day restriction. It is defined as an exclusive bandwidth set aside for specific dates and times. More bandwidth required than normal. So this is given to you when there's more bandwidth required than what you would typically need, and it is based on priority. So like if you are downrange and you have multiplexing equipment set up for transmitting data, and then you as like an airman or a staff sergeant are trying to run a mission that doesn't matter as much as what the full bird colonel comes down and says, hey, I got to get on this, and I need all the bandwidth so that I can send this mission for like concerning troop movement or whatever. He's going to get all of that for whatever specific amount of time during that day that he. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions on bandwidth allocation techniques before we move into network infrastructure? Okay. Network infrastructure. I don't know. I didn't say slide, Mr. Mayor.
You're
you
fine.
Probably.
I can keep
All
up.
right, cool. Because I still can't see it, so
You're
I'm
fine.
trying to load in.
If there's some confusion, I'll ask.
Copy. All right, so network infrastructure is a network that involves 2 or more users that interchange voice, video, data, message traffic. This is done across the transmission line, and adequate bandwidth must be considered when you're building a user. So depending on what type of mission that certain individual has whenever you're building that user, or trying to figure out how much bandwidth that specific person needs. Those things need to be considered whenever you're talking about network infrastructure. Slide. There are 2 electronic industry agency standards that you need to learn about in Block 7, and they are EIA 232 Charlie and EIA 530. Now, something to note is that we don't really discuss the military standard equivalent. That information is available in your study guide workbook, but we don't really hit on it. So I will talk to you about that once we get there, but I'd just like to highlight that so y'all remember to look that up. So slide. EIA 232 Charlie was developed for communications between modems and computers. Transmits 56 kbps up to 50 feet and 9.6 kbps, 500 and 5,000 without the use of modems. So why do you think that the transmission speed slows when we have to transmit it farther? And that's just for anybody that wants to answer.
It's time to travel there. Path loss.
Right, path loss. So you have why we use repeaters. That's why we use transponders with SATCOM. We have to be able to amplify our signal and pump it up to get to where it needs to go. But you're going to talk about those later on in the block. Repeaters specifically for Block 7. Right, so something important to note on this slide is that transmission rate in relation to how far and how those 2 things correlate. Tracking?
Tracking. Yes, sir.
Cool. Slide. EIA transmission lines. The first we will talk about is balanced, which uses a differential transmission, 2 wires that carry the data. So if y'all have probably heard about twisted pair once or twice in either Dolan or Jones Hall, right? Like a twisted pair cable.
Yes, sir.
So that's what this is. A twisted pair cable is a balanced transmission line. That's where data is carried on both wires within the shielding, and the data on one wire is required to be 180 degrees out of phase with the data on the other wire. Because what do you think would happen if you had both of those wires twisted and wrapped around each other trying to transmit on either line and they weren't out of phase?
You'd get some interference from the other line.
Right, especially if you're trying to transmit something similar, the same thing, similar frequency, or what have you, you'd get a little bit of interference because they're right next to each other, being transmitted on the same path, or well, a path that's side by side, right? Slide. EIA transmission lines, we will talk about unbalanced now, and that uses a single-ended transmission, and only one wire is used to transmit data in both directions. The second one acts as a ground. This is a coaxial cable. And y'all have probably seen your fair share of coaxial cables if you've ever hooked up like a modem to your wall at your house or your apartment or wherever you live before you came into the military, right? Yeah. So coaxial cables are considered unbalanced transmissions. Slide. So we're going to talk about the physical characteristics concerning EIA now. The D-shaped DB connectors are installed on each end of the computer modem interface cable. So Mr. Mayor, I like to use the example of, I think the VGA cables that you use on the back of the monitors are like a 15 pin, right? This is where I usually talk about that. But do you have like a good example for this slide?
Yeah, you just mentioned that. We used to have 9-pin printers. Some of the netbooks, the ones that, if you signed out one of those netbooks, it's on the side. If you got a laptop, you can use that DB connector to connect another monitor. Those are some examples. Also, on the back of the NSM, are some DB connectors. Those are 50 pins. You know, when you're connecting your NSM to the BERTs. Have
Yes,
you
sir,
guys
I do
gone
remember
in
that.
and done that yet?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's what that is. It's a DB connector. You can only install it one way.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, sir.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I usually just use the example of like the VGA cables whenever you're hooking up a monitor to a PC or to your laptop if you're trying to use an external monitor.
Mm-hmm.
They have those pins, and there's a specific pin count that correlates to what type of DB blank connector that it is. And then you can actually go in there and look at the connector male end and just count how many pins it has, and that usually signifies whether it's DB9, DB25, like how it says in the slides, for instance. All right. Slide. Some electrical characteristics. BIA specifies logic types and voltage levels. So when it says negative logic for data signals, whenever you're reading any kind of binary, I'm sure y'all have probably made the correlation where a logic high or a 1 typically represents something that's correct, and then a logic low or a 0 is something that typically is represented negatively. Am I right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So whenever it says negative logic for data signals, it means just that. They're oppositely, what's the word that I'm looking for? They're inversely, there we go, proportional to each other. So positive voltage is represented by a logic 0, whereas you would typically think it would be represented by a logic 1 because it's positive, but it's the inverse for data signals. And then control signals are, as you would imagine them, represented by a logic 1 for positive volts and a logic 0 for negative. Slide. EIA 530 developed in response to the slower standards that 232 Charlie was created for, and this is what you will find in most networks today. Again, here we have our transmission rate and our distances between 20K and 2 meg up to 3 miles. Slide. DTE and DCE. Your data terminal equipment is considered the source and destination or a computer, and the DCE establishes, maintains, and ends a transmitter or a modem. So the correlation I like to make here so that I can differentiate between the two of them and remember which is that computer terminal, data terminal equipment. And then your DCE is everything else in between. So your DCE connects DTEs together essentially. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Does anybody have questions on network infrastructure? Okay. Transmission media, 4 types that talk about in one Charlie. You've got twisted pair, coaxial, fiber optic, and wireless. Now we hit on twisted pair and coaxial a little bit earlier, so I'm not going to beat on these too hard. Twisted pair consists of copper insulated wires that are twisted around each other, utilizes baseband transmissions only, and is a balanced transmission. Slide. Coaxial cables consist of a copper wire core surrounded by insulation. This one, however, can use baseband and broadband and is a unbalanced transmission. Hey, we talked about that already, didn't we? And then you have your fiber optic cable. Transmits data using light. What? What is that? What are fiber optic cables made out of?
Glass.
Yep. That's why they're so expensive. But because they transmit data using light, they can facilitate far greater speeds and larger amounts of data. So I think we have like up to 3 gigabit connections now, if I'm not mistaken, for wired transmission concerning fiber optic. Can anybody fact check me on that?
I would, but I'd have to
Search.
pull up my internet and it would bump me off the live stream.
Sure. Yeah, I think the last time that I looked, the fastest that I've seen is like a 3 gig down connection. I don't even remember what the upload speed was rated at. But yeah, pretty quick stuff, fiber optic. And supposedly, now that we're about to talk about wireless in the next slide, supposedly 5G is expected to surpass wired fiber optic connection. In theory, that's the speculation. I don't really know how true that's going to be though, because that's insane to me. Like everything that I've ever been taught or ever learned about wired connections, I've never known anybody to be like, oh yeah, the wireless connections will someday surpass wired because wired is usually way more reliable. But wireless transmission media transmits and receives data without the use of wires. That's a crazy concept, right? But when we're talking about wireless transmission media, in Block 7, you have your TISR, which uses a wireless transmission via line of sight. And in Block 8, you'll talk about different types of you'll talk about different types of network configurations for your radios using SATCOM, and you actually have a SAT SIM in the room to do the labs, and you'll wirelessly send each other emails, messages, voice calls, things like that. Slide. So, Mr. Mayor, you have a good way of talking about the DSU and CSU that I can't remember offhand. And I explained this one fairly blank. Would you be opposed to covering the DSU and the CSU?
In other words,
Because you actually have like that photo that you pull
yeah,
up,
I do.
and you
I
showed
just
it to
gotta
me a
remember
couple of
where
times.
That.
Yeah.
If I bump you off, it's not intentional. I just gotta find it. Okay. There's the DTE and the DCE. Where did I put it? This is going to require an internet one. Well, I mean, I could try just by... There's a hierarchy. You would have thought that I would have had the others.
Oh, if you can't get to it, sir, it's not an issue. I just, there's that picture that you showed me a couple of times on Google, I think.
That is correct. I'm going, where did I put those things? I got the, the hierarchy, I got the DTE, the DCE, I'm like, what the heck happened?
Right.
It disappeared. All right.
It's all good, sir.
Oh, wait a minute.
We could just go.
Found it.
Nice.
Copy it. Paste it. Can everybody see that picture?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
All right. Always remember that the DSU and CSU, the DSU and the CSU can be in the same box. The DSU is always the customer side, and you can see where the router is and your LAN, where all the users could be. The CSU is on the network side. Now, each one of these has a purpose. Now, a lot of people get the CSU and DSU confused because of the C being, oh, it's customer. No, it's not. So let me get this, undo this here real quick, and just briefly go over the digital service unit. Now, you can see it connects between the routers of two separate networks. Well, that's what you just seen, is the DSU is on the opposite side there. So you take a look at the word alternate mark inversion. You guys have gone over signaling format. That's RZ bipolar. Alternate mark being, well, if you get a 1, let's go positive on the first one. and you get another logic level 1, well, I'm going to go negative. That's that alternate mark inversion. And again, that's the customer side. When you take a look at the channel service unit, that's on the opposite side of the, and again, let me post this picture again. The CSU is where all the servers are. So that's the network side. DSU's with the customer again. Let me get rid of it here. So when you look at that, look at the signaling format. This is RZ bipolar with 0 suppression. And it also says that it polices one's density. You know, he's like, the network uses that. We don't. We're always the alternate mark inversion bipolar. It is not self-clocking. The RZ bipolar with 0 suppression is. So when you are having problems with your internet and you got to call one of those communications companies like AT&T or Verizon, they're going to be checking the DSU, CSU to figure out where the problem is and where to send the technician. That's, in a nutshell, what the DSU and CSU uses. Any questions on those two? Because it can be confusing. Again, pull up that picture that I have, like this one. I use Google Images, and that's how I am able to describe what's actually happening. Any questions? Did I lose you? Okay. Let me, somebody said something out there. I couldn't hear them.
That sounded like just somebody having a conversation in the background.
Yeah,
an echo or something
it
like
did.
that.
That was the CQ announcement, sir.
Oh, okay.
Oh, nice. Everybody get down outside right now.
Just drill team for retreat.
How do they maintain their spacing and still do drill team stuff?
No idea, Sergeant.
I was just thinking about that. I'm like, man, they do little crossovers and stuff that are just pretty close to each other. That doesn't sound like it falls within social distancing parameters.
All right, Sergeant,
Okay.
Yeah,
pick
Sergeant.
up with
Even
hierarchy?
marching looks pretty bad.
I can imagine. Yes, sir. Hierarchy is the slide that we are on, Mr. Mayor.
Roger that.
Thank you for that, by the way.
You're welcome.
So your hierarchy is a logical sequence in building transmission rates in a network. Insufficient bandwidth at one level requires a network to increase to the next highest level. So if you have one input channel, you'll be at the DS0 level, and your maximum data rate will be set at 64 kbps. But then if you have a requirement for a higher data rate or more users that need access to more channels, you would have to bump yourself up to that T1 line, and that can facilitate it up to 24, and so on. I think your study guide workbook goes up to a T4 line, if I'm not mistaken, whenever it's talking about the levels and the data rates. And I don't really have any kind of like aha funny thing to remember this by. This is just one of those things that you're going to have to get in the repetition and look at it enough. Typically, whenever I'm teaching block 7s, I'll have my students come in and write them on the board every day in the morning, like the NSM ports, how many of each one, and the data rates, the max data rate that they can have. And then I'll have them write the hierarchy up there too. I honestly don't really know any of any other, because I'm a huge proponent of like repetition and flashcards and things like that. So yeah, this is just one of those things that you're going to have to look at enough and write enough for however you study to get down pat.
Okay, I brought one picture up. I'm not sure if you guys can see it because it is kind of grainy to a certain extent, but what he's trying to say there, is the T1 mux. You'll have channel 1s through channel 24, and then that makes one T1. So you're going to have in a T2 mux, you're going to have 4 of these T1s with 24 channels each coming into there. That's what they're looking at. Now, each one of those T1s is right around 1.544 megabits per second. And then after it gets made, and this is the reason why they say hierarchy, is you go into the T3. You'll notice that we have a whole bunch of T2s in line. So just one T1 going into a T2, man, that's a lot of channels there. So you can see it starts adding up. And this one goes all the way to T5. I'm not sure if you can see it there, Sergeant Young. But it just gives you an idea of how far these things have gone as far as hierarchy is concerned.
Now my stream on my device is still loading. I'm not too sure what's going on. I may have to restart my phone after this.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Well, that's what we do is we help each other.
Absolutely. So now that we've covered hierarchy, we are at the end of 1 Charlie. Does anybody have any questions about any of the information that we've covered so far?
No, sir. But as for the fastest optical speed that we've achieved, it's 255 terabits per second.
Holy crap.
That's so fast. Why would you need that? Oh my god. That's insane. I feel like that would be for maybe some kind of like corporation or business, maybe?
Yeah, I don't think that's available to the general public.
Oh my goodness. That's so fast for like no reason. Like, what are you even doing with all of that? Okay. So no questions at all? I know there's only been like a few people talking. I just want to make sure that everybody's good before we move on. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right. I guess we can move on to
1 Delta.
1 Delta then.
Yes, sir.
And these next couple PowerPoints are going to be fairly quick. We're just covering the NSM and the BERTs that you're going to be using during the NSM labs, which are the HST3000s, but that's going to be in 2 alpha. And just let me know when you have the objective slide up, Mr. Mayor, because I'm still not working. Cool. All right, in Objective 1 Delta, we will identify the basic facts about the principles, capabilities, and limitations of multiplexing equipment. Slide. As an RF transmission systems technician, you may work with specific multiplexing equipment, such as the nodal satellite multiplexer configured in a satellite network. You're going to see these again in Block 9. I don't teach Block 9, so I don't know to what extent they actually use them, but it's fairly user-friendly as far as multiplexing equipment is concerned. At least in the span of what I've worked with in my Air Force career, NSMs are fairly simple because it interfaces with your laptop software, and then it has the software generated to where you just plug in parameters to match what the transmission rate and everything's supposed to be coming out of what port. But you'll get to see that whenever you go in for your lab. Just out of curiosity, who's working with y'all for the labs on T-Ship?
Mr.
Beal.
Mr. Beal? Nice. Yeah, him and Mr. Mayer, I've learned a lot from those two, just from like when I first started teaching this block back in, it's been, year and a half? March of 2019 I came here. But yeah, I picked up a lot of stuff from like Mr. Beal, Mr. Mayer, and Mr. Miller, our civilian guys that we've got teaching the block. So that's awesome. Does he talk to you all a lot about the objective content, like when you're there, like as you're going through the labs and stuff like that?
Yes, sir. He asked us about it.
Yes, sir. He's
cool.
He's really informative. It's really cool.
That's awesome. Good stuff. All right, slide. To cover our overview, we will be discussing the Vertex nodal satellite multiplexer, which is the piece of equipment that you're going to use for your lab. We will cover the purpose, the functional description, a couple operational characteristics, and then the configuration settings. And the configuration is mostly just identifying and making sure that you know and you're aware of which TOs to use for doing your controls and indicators, looking up any kind of operational parameters that you would need to know about the NSM. Slide. The purpose of the NSM is to multiplex group port input data and secure and non-secure digital voice order wire for transfer to the aggregate interface. That definition sounds a lot like a standard multiplexer, right? Like whenever we're talking about general multiplexing terms.
Yes, sir, it does.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, a multiplexer is a multiplexer is a multiplexer. It's like the same thing with a radio. They're never usually too far off from one another. There might be like one or two different variations or the capabilities as far as the operating frequencies or data rates that it's capable of facilitating. By and large, multiplexers do just about the same thing across the board. So you're having a bunch of user input, and then you're combining essentially all of those user inputs to transmit across an aggregate path to your distant end. Because on your distant end, your NSM is also capable of demultiplexing that incoming aggregate, which is, i.e., like splitting it up, put in simpler terms, and then transmitting that information or routing that information to the end users and where it needs to go. And we'll talk about the maximum output data rate on the next slide because it outlines it in one of the input port data rates. Or not the next slide, in a couple slides rather. Slide. NSM has two operational modes, legacy and enhanced, and as it says, these are selectable via the NSM. I don't know why, I'm not too sure why it says configuration cut sheet. It's a setting that you have to select on the cut sheet, but the actual setting is on the GUI or your laptop that's interfaced with. So it's actually a setting on the software that you can change. But this information, as far as the operational modes, those two things are available in your TO as long as you know where to look and where to go find them. Slide. The input ports and maximum data rates for the NSM, you have 12 NRZ, 6 T1E1 ports, 6 CDI, and 2 HISI. These are the associated data rates with those ports, and when I said we'll talk about the maximum output data rate being 52 meg, that's displayed right here. So your two high-speed serial interface ports are going to give you the capability to transmit at 52 meg. And these data rates are per port, not combined total. Like your 12 NRZ ports aren't splitting 8.44 meg. It's 8.44 meg per. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. Because I have a lot of people ask me about that. That seems like it'd be awfully slow, sir, splitting 8.4 meg 12 times. It's like, yeah, that's because it's not that way. All right. And then in the next couple of slides, you have your operational characteristics and your NSM configuration. That just tells you to refer to the handouts that you get and your TO extracts that are associated with the NSM. So any kind of operating characteristics or configuration requirements, you can find those in your NSM TO extracts. Have y'all actually like put eyes on and like gone through those TOs a little bit just to familiarize yourself with them and make sure you can find certain information?
Yes, sir.
Cool. Yeah, because
So
that's super
sorry to
important.
interrupt.
Say again?
Sorry to interrupt, but Collins and I have lab in 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you gotta go, you can head out, do what you gotta do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
We're
I'm
recording
gonna
Absolutely.
this, so I'm going to post it on the RF Transmissions website. Just look under Block 7 for your class. And I'll give you a link to it in the class description of, 221 here.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions about Unit 1 Delta before we move on?
Sir.
Okay.
No, sir.
Sweet. All right, let's go ahead and get 2 alpha knocked out. Just let me know when you're ready, Mr. Mayor.
Ready?
Okay. The objective of 2 alpha, we will identify basic facts about the capabilities and limitations of the bit error rate test set, or BERTs. And the BERTs that we are concerned with for this objective and for this block is the HST 3000. As an RF transmission systems technician, troubleshooting signal quality across a network requires you to know the basics of a bit error rate test set. Now, there will be multiple kinds of different bit error rate test sets that you will encounter throughout your career. We actually used I don't know if you've used this one, Mr. Mayor, but we had a Firebird hooked up to our fixed SATCOM terminal.
Yep.
And that's what we used for counting all of our bit error whenever we were transmitting data to our distant end, which was over in the Middle East. So that was pretty sweet, being able to see the numbers count up, which obviously is a bad thing, but actually getting to put hands on equipment like that was cool. I'm a very hands-on kind of guy when it comes to like set up, tear down of like antennas and radios and everything like that. It's my jam. All right, let's go slide. As an overview, we will cover the basic BERTs description and the HST 3000 operation. This is going to be pretty short and sweet to the point. Slide. Your basic BERTs is going to be able to perform tests and loopbacks on a system to adequately analyze signal quality as it travels across a network. This is primarily done non-intrusively, and it runs like alongside your data transmissions. And it does that by comparing your received signal patterns with your transmit patterns. Slide. HST 3000 operation. It is a rugged, handheld, and battery-operated piece of equipment. Whenever you hold it in your hand, it almost reminds me, I don't know if anybody remembers it, because it's slightly bigger, but I don't know if anybody remembers those the old school Game Boys, like not the colors, I forget which one it was, but they were like gray, I think. But it reminds me a lot of those. But yeah, it's built to last. It also operates with many different communication devices, and the Datacom module in the HST 3000 is used for end-to-end testing and also bit error rate testing. And those two things are defined for you here on your slide. Next slide. Now we get into the important stuff. In the HST 3000, you have 3 different test modes that you can use. You have DTE emulation, DCE emulation, and monitor. Now, when we talked about DTE and DCE earlier, data terminal equipment and data communications equipment, why do you think that we would need to emulate those things? Does everybody know what emulation is?
Yes, sir.
So why do you think that we would need to emulate data terminal equipment?
So we can test it.
Right, so that we can see the information coming from NSM in this instance as a piece of data terminal equipment, and what would be read typically at that end of the data. And then the same goes for your DCE emulation. If you're trying to troubleshoot and see what's occurring, if it were to be considered DC, then that's what you would have the settings configured to on your HST. And then when you're monitoring, it's just the non-intrusive performance monitoring of a circuit in both directions. So you're just analyzing the data that's traveling back and forth from you to your distance. And I think, Mr. Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong, we primarily use DTE emulation for our loopbacks when we're doing the NSM labs, right?
It's been a while. I'd have to go back and look at the cut sheet.
No, sure. I'm pretty confident. No, you're good, sir. I'm pretty confident that it's a DTE emulation that we're operating in.
I agree with
whenever
you on that, but again, I would love to see the cut sheets for that. I would
right for the actual verbiage.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Slide. And that's all she wrote, y'all. Does anybody have any questions about our bit error rate test set
Actually,
I don't know if he cut off or.
Yeah, your audio cut out. Whoever that was talking.
oh, my apologies.
I think it happened again.
It did. Like right before he was about to start his statement, just like the last
Back a
time.
slide, sir. That's what my roommate was asking.
What was that?
Oh, he's your roommate. Nice. Good job. Is there anything specific that he was curious about on the slide? Or do
Yeah,
you just want to see it
I was
again?
gonna see if you can go back to the DTE and the DCE and monitor slide. Thank you, Sergeant.
Oh, that's Mr. Mayor controlling the slides. But you're welcome.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You're very welcome.
Oh, that's right. You don't have the slides available to you. That's why you were wanting to go back and look at it. Isn't that right?
Do you guys have the
Slides
slides?
in the Google Drive, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and also should be on Discord if you really need them.
Did you have anything that you were curious about specifically when it came to the test modes?
No, Sergeant. I just wanted to take another.
Okay, sure.
Again, this is being recorded, so you're more than welcome to go back and refresh your memory on this too when I send you the link.
Alrighty, sir. Understood. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So before we wrap this up, does anybody have any questions on 1 Charlie, 1 Delta, or the 2 Alpha information that we covered today?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Perfect. So tomorrow, like I was telling you earlier, we're going to do a pretty lengthy in-depth review, and we'll be covering everything from 1 Alpha to 2 Alpha, as well as anything else that you all bring to the review. We can ask any kind of questions or anything like that concerning the content that we've covered so far.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, unless y'all have anything else for me or Mr. Mayor, you are good to go.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Not a problem.
All right, have a good night.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, y'all as well. Thank you for coming.
If anybody else has any questions later on tonight, I'm on late. Playing
Understood,
World of
sir.
Tanks. So if you send me a message, I'll see it.